Hey guys, thanks for checking out this clip of Anatomy of the Church and State. Be sure to catch the full episode on Rumble or ChristiansForLiberty.com. Links are in the show description. So let's kind of, get into that a little bit. When did we see the Church of America start to split from politics from you got to be a churchgoer to get elected to where we are now? When did that start happening?
That's tough because it's not one sudden, explosive moment.
Right.
Like I can point it out, 1921, that's the year, right? Like it's a slow drip, and it happens in one part of America at a different time than another. New England stayed pretty firm for a while, but in the early 1800s, especially, things like they started to really question their Christian Puritan roots and all that stuff. They started to reject that for the more romanticized eras, deists, and this drift of theology hit them. And as those things start to play in effect, they start to give up God, although not completely. Princeton Theological Seminary was still a pretty solid bastion of firm faith, even into the very late 1800s. People like Henry Van Dyke were writing sermons in the late 1800s from Princeton saying things like, hey, we expect our leaders to be Christian, and if we don't have Christian leaders, we can't be surprised. If he put it on us. Henry Van Dyke said, if you don't have Christian leaders, it's because you're not living a Christian life at your house. God knows, and he's not going to give you something you don't have at home. You can't ask God for Christian leadership on the political stage when back at home, you're not on your knees praying. And I was like, man, that's true. It is interesting how he says he gives you the leadership that reflects the heart of the homes. When the hearts reflect Christ, you will get the leadership that matches it. So this idea, it's not all at once or all quick. I think the Civil War probably broke a lot of people spiritually. And during the Civil War, the average Civil War soldier afterwards would drink 35 gallons of alcohol a year, and would take very high levels of medicine and stuff like that. Things they were prescribed during the war that, things like cocaine and, hemp and all this stuff that they became addicted to. And it was a very hard time. So things like the prohibition and stuff started to roll in. And as that progressive era got caught up and got moving, politics and Christianity were still deeply embedded. But just with the rise of things like socialism and stuff, it became harder for people to know what do Christians do? Do they help support the poor like the Christian socialists are telling me? Do they fight against alcohol like the prohibitionists are telling me? That's one wing of Christianity, is saying go in that kind of progressive direction. These other Christians were saying, no, we go back to the traditional things that we've done all along. But the traditional things led us to the Civil War. It is the idea of what people are saying. So they're trying to figure out what is Christianity to me in this era? And what is Christianity to me in this era when evolution is telling me that I'm not even really I'm an animal? And all the smart Christian intellectuals are agreeing with that, but the backwoods Baptist pastors are the ones saying no. And then eugenics is in full swing. All these kinds of wild things are happening all at once. And just through that slow drip, it moved people away. A lot of the theologians during that time too, a lot of the pastors in that time would go over to Europe to get their education. I think that really hurt them as they kind of got drifted into that liberal drift that had already been in Europe for 100 years. It really swept over them, but not all of them at once. New England went much quicker in that leftward direction, but the South stayed very firm for another 150 years. Even still today, there are places where it's still pretty firm. I mean, there are definitely small towns where if you weren't at church, it would be hard for you probably to get elected still. And so, what about the West? They never really had those Christian roots. Places like Washington and Oregon, it wasn't really as big a deal for you to be the Christian. Yet places like Texas and it was definitely a big deal. And in places like Kansas City, they were always kind of outlaws and Jesse James types. So they didn't. Every place was a little bit different and a little bit thing. It's difficult. I used to live in China, and people will be like, "What's life like in China?" I'm like, well, I can tell you what life is like in these two cities a little bit that I lived in. These two massive cities that one of them was bigger than New York City, and it wasn't even considered a very big city by Chinese standards. But I have no idea. But China's huge. It's the same size as the United States. And I can't tell you what it was like to be a rice farmer out in the East. And I can't tell you what it was like to live down in the tropics in the Southeast. I can just tell you what these little narrow perspectives are like. And I think it's the same with America. Saying, when did Christianity drift out of America? In some places it's still present, or at least somewhat prevalent. And in other places it's been gone for 150 years. Woodrow Wilson was the last nail in that coffin for some of them. And it really depends on where you are.